if Western governments got behind the miners, if we had access to limitless government funding, we could mine the metals we need for an energy transition readily. No problem. We can do it. And we can do it in a greener way. And we can make this total change in the next 10 years.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets?
Welcome back to Markets in Transition on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. Our guest today is Robert Friedland, founder and executive chairman at Ivanhoe Mines. We'll be discussing the state of the energy transition, which metals are truly critical, and how we need to work together to re-engineer our energy system. Hello, Robert. Welcome back to Smarter Markets.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure.
Well, it's a great pleasure to have you with us here again. It's been too long. We just had our 200th episode, and you were our guest on the very first episode of Smarter Markets. And across all those episodes in between, we've had many conversations on the energy transition and its implications. And I wanted to talk with you today about how you see the current state of the energy transition. And I thought we could start with the supply of critical minerals and metals. We know it'll take a lot of these minerals and metals, including copper, nickel, lithium, to meet the needs of the energy transition for a more electrified energy system powered by low-carbon renewables and nuclear. We've seen near-term oversupply in markets like nickel and lithium that send prices crashing. So I guess I wanted to ask you first, where do you think we are today in terms of being able to supply the amount of critical minerals and metals that we'll need for tomorrow?
That's a very big and very important and fundamental question. Since we started this podcast, and 200 have gone out into the universe now, we have been subjected to an absolute blizzard of misinformation and disinformation about what constitutes an energy transition and what critical raw materials we need to get there from here. So we can separate out the existential question, what the two words energy transition means, then we can settle on the critical raw materials. We'll just note that the Mediterranean Sea was hotter last summer than ever recorded. There are over 600 water tornadoes in the Mediterranean Sea. We'll take it as a given that the anecdotal experience of the hot weather the last few years globally supports the thesis that we have anthropomorphic global warming and that we need an energy transition. However, for 1 billion people, an energy transition is for the woman of the household just to be able to cook with natural gas rather than wood. So let's set aside the words energy transition for a moment. We should probably come back to that and talk about critical raw materials. If you want to electrify the world economy, if that's what we're talking about in energy transition, clean electrical energy that does not generate global warming gas and that does not exacerbate or trigger an even more critical cycle of the Earth warming itself, because as it gets to a certain temperature, we could melt the polar ice caps, we could release huge amounts of trapped methane that are frozen in northern Russia, for example, into the atmosphere, and we could get into a reinforcing cycle where global warming gets even hotter because we trigger sort of a greenhouse effect. Setting all that aside, there is essentially an ocean of disinformation and misinformation about the critical raw materials required. So let's go into that and let's peel that onion and get some people to understand a little bit about it. First of all, as we talk today, we're burning as much crude oil per day as we ever have as a species. We're right near our all-time highs at about 103 plus million barrels per day. So we've spent trillions of dollars on windmills, and solar farms, and it has not reduced materially the amount of crude oil we're burning as a species every day. And we're still burning vast amounts of coal. There's been no actual reduction because we're still using more and more energy in the world. And while the percentages come down, maybe 1% increase in renewables, the denominator got so big, the demand got so big that we made zero progress. And if you want to add on top of that, data centers now, big data and military demand for big data, we are fooling ourselves if we're talking about any material improvement in anthropomorphic global warming. More importantly, people are beginning to understand the importance of mining and critical raw materials. If you want to come up with a holistic scheme to stop burning crude oil or stop burning coal, which are at the core of the issue, that's what human beings do, we really need to look at the supply chain. And about 99.999999999% of the time, the media has it wrong. Implicit again in your question. No, we don't need nickel for the energy transition. And we certainly don't need lithium carbonate or lithium hydroxide. And so the list of critical raw materials that are lumped together in the mass media are virtually always wrong. They're repeated by journalists that have no idea about the supply chain and no idea of the fundamentals of physics or where things come from or where technology is going. So there is no shortage of nickel and there is no shortage of lithium. Lithium is an unbelievably common metal in the crust of the earth. It's widely available. There are supply chain issues, there are antiquated technologies, but there are no shortages of nickel and lithium whatsoever. And you see that reflected in their prices, which have collapsed and will continue to collapse as technology addresses these issues. Lithium is the lightest metal in the known universe. There may be other universes, parallel universes, but it's the third element in our periodic table, and it's everywhere. If we want to find a lithium deposit, it's everywhere, including in the ocean's waters. And new technology is allowing humanity to collect that lithium into metallic form in one step from brines, oil field brines that are globally available. There's no shortage of lithium at all. The problem is that the media thinks the energy transition equals electric cars. No, not true. We can't green the world by building 10, 20 billion electric cars. That's a ludicrous proposition and has nothing to do with the energy transition. It's just everybody wants to get rid of these belching internal combustion engines and assigns a huge market valuation for anybody that looks like they can make progress towards that enterprise. But we will not green the world by building tens of billions of electric cars. No, we won't. Not going to get there from here. Because everybody confuses electric cars with energy transition, we really need to slow down and parse this discussion. Energy transition, energy is a word we could discuss endlessly, but for the purposes of this discussion, let's say energy is electricity that we want to use for a good human purpose without generating global warming gas. When Ben Franklin had a kite and a lightning bolt hit his kite and he started thinking about electrical energy, there was no global warming gas associated with that lightning bolt. There are many forms of electrical energy that we can generate that do not generate global warming gas. But the first fundamental proposition is we need to run this world primarily on electrical energy, not chemical energy, not burning coal, not burning oil. I think that's what most people think about as energy transition, using electrical energy for useful work. So we have to talk about how we generate energy and how we transmit energy and how we utilize energy. And electric cars are a subset of that utilization. But they're not the whole story. They're not the whole story at all. So if you want to change the way we generate electrical energy, that has nothing to do with lithium. If you want to build a nuclear power plant, if you want a fusion reactor, if you want to develop geothermal power And that's the first step of the transition, generating clean energy. It has nothing to do with the so-called shortage of lithium or even nickel. If you build a nuclear power plant, there's a lot of stainless steel in that power plant, and that stainless steel requires nickel to make the stainless steel. There are forms of stainless steel that don't use nickel, but lumping all of these elements together by journalists as critical raw materials is completely idiotic. And by the way, if we have to rely on extremely bizarre or arcane elements that the media keeps rhapsodizing about, like rare earths, which are not rare and are not earths, we're never going to get there from here because people have no idea of what they're talking about when they sort of mouth politically correct words about energy transition. And of course, the more you learn about it, the more you realize the popular media is just dead wrong. From Elon Musk's side, maybe it's all just woke nonsense. From a plasma physicist's point of view, it's definitely possible for humanity to change the way we generate power, transmit power, and utilize power in a way that we really and truly stop burning 104 million barrels of oil per day and burn an astronomical amount of coal to generate that power in the first place. Anybody should know that if you live in the United States and you buy an electric car, it's approximately 50% a coal-burning car. Our grid still generates massive amount of electrical energy by burning coal. It has nothing to do with lithium. Forget about the lithium. We're just burning coal to generate electrical energy. And China is still adding as many coal-burning power plants per year as exists in Spain, or some years as exists in England. Every year in new coal-burning power plants, even though China is doing more to jump into an energy transition than any other major industrialized country.
I wanted to ask you about that because it sounds like you're saying we got too much focus on the use of the electricity, the batteries, the getting it into cars. We're not focusing enough on how that electricity is being generated and being able to replace coal, fossil fuels in the power generation side. And, China's made some pretty impressive strides with the increase in solar they're using for generating the power. What do you think we need to be doing to generate that electricity? And what minerals and metals are critical to that? Or what technology do you see as critical for generating the electricity?
David, here we go again. Generating, number one, transmitting, number two, and utilizing the energy, number three. Everybody forgets about number two. If there's no transmission, you don't get from generating to utilization, okay? We're so far away from getting this right, and yet it is so attainable. It is so doable. It's just we have to look at the amount of effort our species puts into war and the preparation for war and the metals required for war. We have to redirect those human energies towards truly having a sustainable energy transition. And in theory, this is something our Chinese brothers agree about and our Chinese sisters. They're just like us. In fact, they've made a bigger effort than the United States relative to the scale of their society. So solar power definitely will not work, and wind power will not work. They're laughably wrong. As you know, the sun does not shine 24 hours per day, and solar cells have a very low energy density. So they're nice. You can generate hundreds of gigawatts of power, hundreds of nuclear power plants equivalent, but how you integrate that into the grid, how do you utilize that is a huge problem. You need storage of energy in the grid. And as you know, the wind doesn't blow all the time. And we're learning these windmills don't have the life we thought they're going to have. They wear out, they're management intensive, sometimes they collapse. And as you know, they chew up birds prodigiously, and the wind doesn't blow all the time. Europe learned that a few years ago. So I think 1,000 years from now, we'll look back at our species, if we're still around and writing it, and we'll look at these as just ludicrous early attempts at energy transition. And we won't be using windmills, and we won't be using solar cells. We won't be paving all of Mother Earth with solar cells. But the intention is good. The industries are large. The intentions are good. We tried, but the engineering is very poor because our grid simply can't take these variations easily. Now, some progress is being made to integrate solar into industrial use. I just had a very enlightening meeting with Huawei in China to hear about their efforts to utilize solar power and intermittent power to convert that into 24-hour stable electrical energy, say for a data center or for a mine. It's possible to do that, but it's nowhere near as elegant as other alternatives. But we really need to examine what are the rational alternatives and what critical raw materials do we really need to get there from here. So I can assure you as a miner, and I think we know everything there is to know about almost nothing. We know about mining. We know about our supply chain. Don't lay awake at night worrying about a shortage of lithium. This planet has plenty of it. Don't lay awake at night worrying about a shortage of nickel. This planet has plenty of it. Worry about the intelligent way we use those metals. We have never been able to find a way to engineer around aluminum or copper. They are absolutely fundamental to any effort at energy transition. And there are a number of themes that need to be emphasized. So please understand, we have to generate the power, we have to transmit it, and then we have to store it. When you put it in a battery, that electrical energy is chemical energy. That's something completely different, how you store that energy in your battery. And then there's the fear of the supply chain. For example, you're probably guilty of having one of these hand phones in your hand. Most people we've become cyborgs. We're sort of addicted to our hand phones. If we lose our phone, the mind-body process experience panic. Maybe the kind of panic that another caveman was chasing you, but we are addicted to these hand phones. Now they've been weaponized. The pagers and the walkie-talkies that Israel exploded shows you that you can put a chemical in a battery. The phone will act normally. It'll be just fine until somebody calls your numbers and it blows up next to your head. And that means that in the near future, it's going to be very hard to carry your phone, you as a cyborg, onto an airplane. And you won't be able to bring your iPad or your personal computer because all forms of chemical stored energy can be weaponized and are very dangerous. So our world is changing very fast. Do you remember when we had the first attempts to blow up aircraft with people carrying a bomb on a plane? Well, guess what? Every electronic item has now been shown to be convertible into a bomb, and that's chemical energy. That's chemical energy in that pager battery, in that walkie-talkie battery, in that Apple phone battery. And now, the technology's out there. People can weaponize it. And so we live in a very rapidly changing world, and 200 podcasts is enough to make the difference between a very primitive and early understanding of energy transition and the much more sophisticated and realistic understanding we need today. Virtually everything you're reading in the popular press is laughably wrong. So we need massive amounts of copper. We've spoken about that. Copper conducts electrical energy better than anything on the periodic table, except for gold and silver. They do an even better job of conducting electrical energy. They're just too expensive and rare. And aluminum conducts electrical energy and also lightweights things. Things need to be lighter. In a transportation world, everything needs to be made lighter. Aluminum and copper, there is no short-term way to engineer around it. There's some good work with graphene. We work with graphene. Excellent way to transmit electrical energy, but it's brittle and it doesn't transmit heat like copper does. So certain metals are absolutely fundamental to this transition. You've got a headphone on. There's copper in those headphones. You're talking to a microphone. There's copper in that microphone. I'm on the other side of the planet. You're in New York. I'm in Singapore. We're 12 hours apart. The copper is absolutely fundamental to be able to talk to each other. So that one we can't engineer around, and we're short copper on this planet if you're really going to have a transition. Now, even to maintain 3% economic growth without an energy transition, we're short copper. That's absolutely fundamental. We have to be copper miners. If we're not copper miners, we're just not going to get there from here. We can cheerfully keep burning coal, and we can cheerfully keep burning oil. The FT just quoted JP Morgan saying a lot of these assumptions are unwarranted, unsustainable. We're seeing it. The Japanese have been saying we need hybrid cars. We need to have a combination of an electric car and a hybrid car. We need to really get the fleet changed. But I want to repeat 100 times over, electric cars does not equal energy transition. It just doesn't. It's a nice thing to do, but the amount of mining you have to do to make every single automobile, old and new, run on electricity in a sustainable way in order to generate the power to that car and to transmit the power to that car is beyond your wildest imagination. And now comes data centers, and now comes war. And these competing demands on electrical energy mean that we really need to get sober and get real about what we're doing here. Otherwise, our adversaries just laugh. I mean, we're all on this planet together. If Russia doesn't stop burning crude oil, if China doesn't stop burning crude oil, it really doesn't matter what you do in the United States.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about that. You mentioned being in China, and if you look, a lot of the production of some of the other metals like nickel and lithium, have been coming out of China, Indonesia. And we're seeing like this kind of growing, say, like east-west tension over mineral security, metal security. Is it being responsibly sourced, sustainably sourced? It seems like we're finding new fault lines instead of ways to cooperate. How are you thinking about the way geopolitics is shaping up around countries trying to make sure that they're able to secure the metals that they believe they need and that they're being sourced in a secure and a sustainable way?
We're experiencing a tremendous balkanization of the world economy into warring organized camps. The camp composed of, say, Western Europe and the United States, or let's say the whatever's the opposition to a Russia and China and Iran and North Korea camp. We are balkanizing the world economy, and that process has been accelerating, and we need to stop the acceleration. We need to get to an equilibrium, and we need to look at where we can compete. The macro trend in that direction is frightening, and will not and cannot possibly lead to a good end when it comes to the question of global warming or the potential for anthropomorphic global warming. As you know, we've just had 2 big hurricanes in the United States that went through Florida, and the damage in North Carolina might be enough to affect the American presidential election. The rains were that bad because politicians like to blame each other for not doing enough hurricane relief. And we've had the hottest temperatures ever recorded in the Mediterranean Sea, ever, which is resulting in water tornadoes, which have a tremendous amount of energy. Water weighs a metric ton per cubic meter. Imagine a tornado made out of water, how much more energy it takes to lift that water miles up into the air. That's formed by hot water in a big bathtub called the Mediterranean Sea. The problem is that long ago, the Chinese are a 5,000-year-old society, centrally planned, intelligent people involved in the planning process, looking at the whole situation. They long ago concluded they could not be dependent on crude oil from the Middle East. They did the sums. If you have 1.3 billion people, that's a huge advantage. And if you have 1.3 billion people, that's a huge disadvantage. If everybody in China had an internal combustion engine, and I mean everybody, and they had to rely on oil from the Middle East, they knew that they could never get there from here. The United States Navy is too proficient. China has only 5 deep water seaports. And the Chinese military, and I'm talking about a generation ago, 30 years ago, said that's not viable. We're never going to be able to be a middle income country and get everybody an internal combustion engine. So they said, well, the sun shines, let's build a solar industry. And the wind blows from Mongolia, from the north. It's cold, so it has a high energy density. Let's build a windmill industry to try to reduce their dependence on crude oil from the Middle East, which had to be brought in through 5 deepwater seaports that could be bottled up by American nuclear submarines. So the energy transition was just based on, originally in China, on national security grounds. Nothing competed with the U.S. Navy, and they don't have a lot of seaports. America's got seaports on 2 coasts, right? We got the left-hand coast and the right-hand coast. China doesn't have that. And China did not win the lottery when it came to crude oil endowment. So it was really based on national security that they started thinking, let's electrify our economy. Plus, they had very bad air pollution. They were burning coal, smoking out their kids. The particulates in the air were first announced by the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. And then when you got your handphone, you could see the particulate index in real time, and that was embarrassing. And the leadership said, well, then we're going to lead the world in the electrification of the economy. And they're still doing that. It's just that the task is so gargantuan. They need hundreds of nuclear power plants. They have to do geothermal power on a massive scale. And even with all their solar and wind, they need to do energy storage on a massive scale. We're involved in a grid scale battery business there so that you can absorb solar and wind into batteries. But it's very important for the people listening to this podcast to understand the immensity of the task and the disruption it has on critical raw materials. Because if a raw material is super rare, we'll never get there from here. There just isn't enough of it. If you think about the movie Avatar, the bad guys were the miners. They were mining unobtainium. This unobtainium existed on some rare planet where the locals held hands in a circle and chanted Om in a beautiful, idyllic, nature-based society. And the miners went there to get that unobtainium. We need to separate out what is obtainable and engineer that in a transition that genuinely results in a reduction on a global basis in global warming gas. And you know that at COP28, it's blatantly obvious. We're approaching a mathematically zero chance of holding global warming to 1.5 degrees if, in fact, human beings are responsible for this warming. If you buy those models, you believe those models, by our own models, we've already lost the 1.5 degree target. We're probably looking at 3 degrees, 4 degrees, 5 degrees. We're looking at a potential runaway greenhouse effect, and we're all going to get punished for it as a species. You saw these hurricanes. You don't normally get 20, 30 inches of rainfall in a day. But it's the same thing's happened in China. There have been these bizarre weather aberrations. And then when you go mining, let's say you want to mine some stuff for the energy transition, you build a tailings pond. That tailings pond, one of those big rainfall events comes along, and it fills the tailings pond, and the tailings pond bursts, and you lose the market capitalization of the mining company. The existential risk of a tailings pond bursting means you can't go mining the unobtainium in the first place because the environmental liability for mining is so high if that tailings dam bursts. Vale and BHP had a tailings dam that burst in Brazil. That one failure resulted in over $40 billion of liability. And they're trying to get a settlement in the $20 billion range that hasn't been accepted by the Brazilian government. And so the major mining companies have these legacy tailings dams. They're scattered all over the planet. As the earth gets warmer, some places actually get more rainfall, and some places actually get less rainfall. The global pattern changes. And if you've got a tailings dam in a place with a lot of rainfall, that tailings dam can fail. And if that tailings dam can fail, you wish you never tried to mine whatever it was you were trying to mine. So we have an interlocking, nested set of engineering dilemmas, how we re-engineer this planet. Now, Elon is anxious to get some human beings on Mars and to make them sustainable in his fear that we're going to eliminate our species, that we have to become interplanetary because we've learned so much. We have so much information. What a shame if we blow each other up and all this accumulated knowledge is lost. I kind of agree with him. It's a rational thing to worry about, and we can get to Mars for sure. But what about the 8 billion of us that are sitting down here on the planet and the beauty of our nature and all the other species that enjoy our planet? We really seriously need to talk to our adversaries and find a way to coexist without getting to the 3-letter word, the most obscene of all words: war, 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 nuclear war. We should go back and watch The Mouse That Roared. All the early fears about nuclear war, all the old songs that were written about nuclear war, because we're simultaneously hurtling towards warring camps run by artificial intelligence and warfare driven by drones and androids and robots. Now, AI uses astronomical amounts of electrical energy. If you do a Google search, and all of us are guilty of doing Google searches, you use the quantum of energy it takes to run a 100-watt bulb for about 10 or 12 seconds. Every time you go, beep, you did a Google search. But there are billions of Google searches per day. They're not free. They're paid for by advertising. But the quantum of energy that's used in those Google searches is astronomical. There's nothing green about it. Now, when we go to an AI search and you ask ChatGPT to write a Valentine's poem for your wife or girlfriend, and you do a GPT search, you're using the quantum of energy to run that light bulb for 2 or 3 minutes. And, humanity uses a lot of its energy on stupid things like writing poetry or pornography. Goes out throughout the universe, a lot of energy involved. But imagine when that energy is used to drive a drone. My drone is coming to kill you. It knows what David looks like. It can recognize you with facial recognition technology. Maybe there's 100 of them looking for you. And there's a latency to the control of that drone from a satellite, say a low Earth orbiting satellite. And the data that drives that data, that's AI. And so if my drone is a billionth of a second faster than your drone, you die. I don't. You know that great book, Flash Boys, about how people move their commodity trading center close to the COMEX or the NYMEX to get a little jump in time on electronic trade. Well, it's the same thing with drone warfare. If the controls on my drone go through 6G wireless to kill you faster than you can kill me, and we automate this thing and we turn it over to robots. I thought we were going to be very careful about how we use AI, but apparently OpenAI is now going to be a for-profit organization after all. There's some really terrifying trends going on here that are crazy energy intensive. I think where a lot of people are admitting just AI is going to require an 8% increase in America's electrical load. Do you have any idea how much energy that is for AI? Like with what? How are we going to generate that power? Because in AI, it can't be solar, it can't be wind, it can't be intermittent. It's got to be 24 hours a day. So people are looking for now old nuclear power plants to start them up again just to run their data center. I mean, it's insane. I mean, how are we going to stop burning oil and gas if everybody's running around building nuclear power plants just to run their data center? Like, let's get real here.
I grew up outside Philadelphia, so when I saw the announcement that 3 Mile Island is being reopened, as the site of the worst commercial nuclear disaster in the U.S., and it's being reopened to supply power to Microsoft for data centers. And I was curious, do you see this as potentially a good thing or a bad thing in terms of if we need to find these other more sustainable types of ways to generate electricity, we still have the transmission issues. Are we going to see a nuclear renaissance, a different type of reactor than the past, geothermal? If you had to place your bets, like what technology for creating the power that we're going to need do you see as potentially there? Or do we just have to realize we're not going to be able to supply all this power?
100% for sure humanity can generate all the power we need, and we can stop burning hydrocarbon and coal. And not only can we do it, as a species, we have to do it. It's just a matter of how much pain we take and how much damage we do to each other before we get there from here. Or alternatively, we have to live on Mars and, 300 of us will carry on the species on another planet. Now, in a sense, nuclear power is terrible and nuclear power is wonderful. It was developed based on uranium. Fission power is based on uranium because it made the beautiful byproduct of nuclear weaponry. When we set the whole thing up, we used uranium rather than thorium. We could have based the whole thing on the thorium cycle, but it never would have generated nuclear weapons. So it's not just that you have to mine uranium. You have to convert it into control rods, and you need the graphite control rods. You need the uranium to be upgraded so that you can use it in a nuclear power plant. So that whole cycle is archaic and generates atomic weapons as a byproduct. And we can continue to build nuclear power plants. They're fine. But what are they made out of? They're made out of these same metals. You need astronomical amounts of copper, and you need nickel for stainless steel. You need specialty metals like niobium for the containment vessel of those nuclear power plants. And America long ago lost the capability to build nuclear power plants. We don't build them anymore. The Chinese build them, the Koreans can build them, the Russians can build them fairly efficaciously. Russia less so, now that they're under sanctions. But the Koreans can build them efficiently. China can build them efficiently, running on the uranium cycle with all of the national security risks as that technology proliferates. Depending upon how ardently concerned you are about global warming, a lot of environmentalists are falling in love with nuclear power again. Not that many people died with 3 Mile Island or the Fukushima disaster. And it just depends. Do you want to die in heat? Do you want to die in cold? Do you want to freeze in the dark? Do you want to be boiled in oil? Nuclear power is definitely 24 hours a day. It can power data centers. If you want to make money in the data business like Microsoft or Google, it's probably the least worst alternative right now is to go back to 3 Mile Island despite the disastrous brand. Imagine Google brought to you by 3 Mile Island. Microsoft brought to you by 3 Mile Island. Terrible idea, but maybe the least worst alternative. But as you know, and we've talked about this in previous podcasts, Mother Earth is a nuclear reactor. The core of the Earth is almost the temperature of the surface of the sun from a naturally occurring fission reaction in the core of the Earth. And so geothermal is an obvious answer. And as you know, our private unicorn, iPulse, is revolutionizing geothermal power by finding a better way to drill. There are others doing this, working on this problem. But once humanity has a faster, cheaper, better way to drill in hot rock, we can generate power 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, forever, from Mother Earth's own natural heat with no global warming effects. And if you look at the cost of, let's say, the Gulf War, you remember shock and awe when America we bombed Saddam Hussein. There's a multi-trillion-dollar cost to that war. It wasn't just $1 trillion or so that we spent bombing the place and finally finding Saddam Hussein and separating his body from his head. But the price of oil went up worldwide for all of humanity. And so the indirect cost was multi-trillions of dollars. You could probably build a case that cost 2 or 3 trillion, just the Gulf War. And so you think that humanity can't figure out a way to drill geothermal wells all over the planet and generate the electricity? Of course we can. But we'll never get there from here when the media is so hopelessly misdirected that the garbage they're talking about, nobody has any basic idea about how to re-engineer the planet. Now, electric cars are great for other reasons. When you live in an urban environment like New York City or Beijing, and you breathe the air from internal combustion engines, there are these sub 2.5 micron particles of heavy metals get into your bloodstream and go beyond the blood-brain barrier, and they're probably the principal cause of dementia, Alzheimer's, cancer, heart disease, according to the World Health Organization. So even if we didn't reduce global warming, it's a great idea to have all cars be electrical. And what Elon has achieved is fantastic, giving the traditional automakers a hot foot and forcing them to start building electrical cars. But don't fool yourself. We've converted a tiny fraction of the global fleet from hydrocarbon to electrical cars. 50% of our electrical load is still generated burning coal. If you buy a Tesla in Quebec, it's primarily a hydropower generated car. And same thing in Norway. If you buy an electric car in Norway, you are proudly driving a hydroelectric dam. And the hippies used to lay down in front of hydroelectric dams. They didn't like the idea of flooding a valley and building a hydroelectric dam. Remember? But New York City is running on hydroelectric power from Quebec. And when the power line failed, all of New York City went black and a lot of babies were made that night. But there was a huge increase in crime in the dark. There is no simple answer here. But the least worst alternative, the best way to solve this problem is with geothermal power. No doubt about it. The heat is right underneath our feet. And the second best would be to generate nuclear power with thorium. And both India and China are working hard on the thorium cycle. Now, a lot of people are talking about small-scale nuclear reactors. They're okay. If I'm building a remote mine site on the North Pole, I'd like a small-scale nuclear reactor for the power, but they run on uranium. And, if they're uranium-based, they're less than ideal. They can be safe. We can engineer a better generation of nuclear power plants. But there are too many lawyers in America, right? And you understand the banana principle, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody. So when you want to put that small-scale nuclear reactor in Scarsdale, New York, just how long is the litigation going to take? And so maybe you could do it in China. If the central government resolves to do it, they have a much shorter permitting process. But in democratic society, where you vote for the least worst alternative for president, where the presidency changes every 4 years, and hence policy changes every 4 years, you can't come up with a commitment of long-term capital to fundamentally transform the way we generate power and transmit it. You can do that in China. You could do that in Russia, where you have a leader that's around for 25 years. You certainly can't do it in the United States. When the Donald becomes president after November 8th, he says he's going to drill, baby, drill, right? And if Kamala is the president, she would probably do the opposite. But this is no way to generate and change your energy transition system if you believe in anthropomorphic global warming. America can probably transform itself faster than most societies, but we won't get there until the mass media understands we don't need lithium in the scale that people think we need it. It's not just about building electric cars. We have to start with how we generate electrical energy and transmit it. Number one and number two come before number three. And the miners are like the gods in this process. Without the miners, we can't even take the first step. Nothing's going to happen without the miners. And so the legacy miners are a critical part of the system. Rio Tinto, BHP, Codelco, Freeport-McMoran, Zijin Mining, the large legacy miners, they have to transform themselves. And without their skill set, what's the plan, Stan? What are we going to mine? Why are we going to mine it? How are we going to mine it sustainably? You remember there's a big copper mine in Panama, Cobre Panama, got shut down by environmental opposition in Panama. That mine burns 300 megawatts of coal to generate the power to mine copper. Well, if we have to burn coal to mine the copper, let's just give up before we start. because the volume of copper we need is so far beyond your imagination. It's just crazy. We've mined 700 million metric tons of copper as a species, going back to Mohenjo-Daro. Go back 5,000 years. We've mined 700 million metric tons of copper. We're using 25 million tons a year right now. Where is that copper? Where is that 700 million metric tons we've already mined? Well, 350 million tons or so is in the American electrical grid. It's in all of our buildings. If you want to get it back, it's easy. Just tear down every single building and everything in America to zero. Make it look like what the Sioux and the Navajo had before we arrived. Get rid of New York City and LA and Chicago, and you'll get your 350 million metric tons of copper back. And there's 100 million metric tons in Great Britain, and then there's Europe with another 150 million metric tons. But that 700 million tons of copper is the modern world. Everything you touch. If you've ever gone into a room and turned on a light bulb, or made a phone call, or ridden in a car, or flown in a plane. So we need another 700 million metric tons of copper in the next 20 years just to maintain 3% GDP growth globally without an energy transition. That's with no energy transition. That's doing things the way we've always done them, with Aramco drilling oil wells and refining oil. The copper intensity obviously goes up when you electrify the world economy. Now, if we go back to burning coal to run the copper mine, we should just give up. So environmental opposition, $10 billion was invested in that mine. Well, Leonardo DiCaprio didn't like the idea. Hollywood came out in opposition. The mine got shut down. We need that copper for the energy transition. We just have to find a way to mine it without burning coal. Now, what's the alternative? I'm building a hydroelectric dam. We're rebuilding a hydroelectric dam in the Congo to mine copper, but the rotor for that hydroelectric dam needs about 90 metric tons of copper. When you build a hydroelectric dam, you need the copper to make the power to mine the copper. You want to build a nuclear power plant, you need an astronomical amount of copper to make the nuclear power plant. You want to fly a more efficient aircraft. You want to replace a 747. There's astronomical amounts of copper in an aircraft. And the widespread ignorance of the supply chain and where things come from, it leaves us miners breathless.
And I want to ask you one last question. So we don't have nearly enough copper. We got to refocus on copper, refocus on aluminum, refocus on how we're going to generate the electricity and have the ability to transmit it. And I wanted to ask you back to the geothermal piece, because that seems to be where you would be focused, or where you would recommend that the world focus its attentions relative to, say, solar or uranium nuclear. If we were to pursue geothermal in a serious way, what do we need to do? What are the steps? Do we still need some technological breakthroughs, or is it more investment dollars and certain resources?
Not only can we do it, we're doing it right now. I'm extremely optimistic about our species' ability to solve this problem. If you take a look at what Elon has managed to do, launch a very large booster into outer space, lifting most of the mass that humanity is sending to outer space, and to bring that booster down backwards and to land it within a half a centimeter of where it took off from, and to grab it with arms before it touches, that proves to you that our species can do virtually anything. But you need that kind of thinking, you need that kind of completely out of the box thinking to get there from here. And the problem of liberating geothermal power, we've solved it. We're doing it right now in a private American unicorn. We have major institutional investors. We started with Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which is a fund that Bill Gates put together. There are a lot of prominent billionaires in that fund. If you go to their website, you'll see their names. And then the European Economic Community invested, and then BHP, the largest of the miners, invested. They're followed by Rio Tinto, the largest of the miners. Then Newmont, the biggest gold miner, came along. Gold is at a nominal all-time high, but we don't need it for an energy transition. All the gold miners want to be copper miners. because they know that they'd rather mine something that we need. We used to put gold in our teeth. We don't do that anymore. So the major mining companies have to be given credit that in their senior management, they sincerely realize their critical role in any potential transition, and they realize what they need to mine and how they need to mine it, which is why everybody wants to buy copper. BHP was bidding for Anglo to get their copper assets. I've been spending time with Maximo Pacheco. He's chairman of Codelco. He's my new best friend. And we sit around all night long talking about how we can, as an industry, save the planet. And all of the burden of this noise about global warming rests on our shoulders. And it's a scale problem. Just look at the scale of the money that goes into armaments. How much money goes into nuclear submarines, intercontinental ballistic missiles. And I'm not saying we shouldn't build nuclear submarines. Maybe we should. The other side is building them. Maybe we should build more ICBMs. The other side is building them. We live in a very dangerous world. Before we blow each other up, threatening each other with mutual assured destruction, we desperately need to find something we agree on. And I'm firmly of the view at my age that China and the United States must establish a set of rules under which we can compete rationally, like the rules for rugby. You can bash into each other and you can break each other's collarbones, but according to a set of rules where we work cooperatively because we're truly all in this together. And I've talked to a lot of my Chinese friends. In fact, I was in Shanghai day before yesterday. I just came out of Beijing and Shanghai. And we need to reestablish communication post-COVID, person to person with the Chinese. And we need to find common ground, even as we balkanize the world into two warring camps. You know that the war in Israel and Gaza is directly genetically related to the war in Ukraine. They're one conflict. Iran is building sophisticated drones and is sending those drones to kill civilians in the Ukraine through Russia. And now North Korean troops are said to be going to go kill Ukrainians on behalf of Russia. And so, this feels like the years before World War II, where the Germans and the Japanese ended up on the same side of the conflict. But in that conflict, the Chinese were America's ally. The Chinese were America's ally against the Japanese. How quickly we forget. We forget that the Chinese name for America is Meiguo, which means the beautiful country. How can we go to war with a society where everybody in that society refers to the United States as the beautiful country? And so let's try our best to increase interspecies communication. Let's have Chinese speak to Americans, and let's focus on what we need here, because the military demand for copper is exactly what is making the energy transition more difficult, because the military demand for copper is the same copper we need for the energy transition. And let's stop filling the airways with all kinds of nonsense about lithium mining and paving the earth in lithium mines. There's much better ways to mine lithium. There's much better ways to store chemical energy. LFP batteries already got rid of nickel and graphite and cobalt in the batteries. Like, just LFP batteries don't use any nickel. They don't use any cobalt. So there's a choice of chemistries in batteries. Pure Lithium, a startup in Boston, has developed much better battery chemistry for chemical energy that doesn't use any nickel, doesn't use any cobalt. It uses lithium metal and a new valence of vanadium. It's a better battery. Humanity can invent a better battery. So all this endless listing of nickel and cobalt as being necessary for the energy transition is nonsense. We do not need cobalt for the energy transition. We do not need prodigious amounts of nickel, and there's plenty of it around, and thank God. But what we need is government policy to avoid war and to put all that liquidity into a real, reasoned energy transition. Could be a renaissance of nuclear power, could be. more rationally, geothermal power could be solar and wind as an interim measure, utilizing better storage technology. You have to store that energy in the grid. And of course, natural gas as a transition fuel. It's just less worse. And it's rational to use natural gas as a transition fuel. It's going to take some of everything. So going back to your question, no, it's not exclusively geothermal. It's not geothermal instead of natural gas or LNG. No, the energy requirement to keep everybody fed and clothed is so great that we have to kind of make a transition. You may have seen my analogy before that I've interviewed over 50 male billionaires, and not one of them that I've found jumps into his pant legs, both legs at a time. Everybody puts one leg in and stands on that leg, and then sticks in the other pant leg. We need that natural gas. It's less worse than coal. It's less worse than oil as part of a transition to something. And the something has to be well engineered and well thought of. If all the world's governments cooperated on geothermal power, we could have distributed power all over the planet, clean and green, at a fraction of the cost of the Gulf War. That's what's so frustrating about all this. At a fraction of the cost of the Gulf War. But it's going to happen, David. It's really and truly going to happen. If you see a guy like Elon, who has repeatedly done the impossible, the world is going to breed a lot more Elons. They're going to come out of India. They're going to come out of China. They're going to come out of the United States. And there's sufficient capital sloshing around. We don't need half the money in the world. We need 1% of the money in the world. And we can re-engineer this planet. And I'm 100% certain it's doable. And I'm sure it's going to happen, providing these warring camps we're creating stop rushing headlong into a nuclear conflict. And so smarter markets implies smarter policy. Now, I think Donald Trump has said some very good things. He said, I don't care if the Chinese sell electric cars in the United States. I don't care if China sells electric cars in the United States, as long as they build them in the United States. That's very pragmatic. I think it's possible to make a deal with him. I think he's listening to Elon Musk. Elon's a hell of an engineer. There's hope. There's hope in any quarter. It's not really necessarily true that the Democrats have all the answers about how to green the world economy. We have to get beyond partisan politics. We have to live through this election season. And then we need the United States of America to get intelligent people to sit down with the Chinese and the Indians and the Europeans and all the Africans and all the South Americans and map out a realistic plan to prevent this planet from warming to 3, 4, 5 degrees, because we made no progress so far. We're burning 104, almost 104 million barrels of oil per day. Today, it's an all-time high, after trillions have been spent on incipient steps on solar and wind. Not good enough. And don't worry, the miners can mine what we need. We can do it. We need more capital, and we need government support. The Chinese miners have government support. They're not tied to net present value models. The Chinese miners are allowed to go out and give them the capital they need. Zijin has grown into a company bigger than Newmont or Barrick in a few years with Chinese government support. If Western governments got behind the miners, instead of beating them to death with a club, if we had access to limitless government funding, we could mine the metals we need for an energy transition readily. No problem. We can do it. And we can do it in a greener way. And we can make this total change in the next 10 years. In the next 10 years, we can do it. Now, it's looking more and more like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, that movie where the walls are squeezing in and this great big giant stone ball is coming down a track to crush you, and you've got to dive underneath a door like a guillotine coming down. It's going to be very close because it's getting hot out there. And these hurricanes, these rains, these heat waves, like Phoenix experienced this year. Phoenix had 110 days. where it never went below 100 degrees Fahrenheit, even at night. It's never happened. Record heat wave in Phoenix, Arizona. What about water? What about agriculture? What about food? We need smarter markets. We need smarter people running smarter markets, and we need to get this podcast into the heads of policymakers. And I'm an optimist. I think we can do it. I think iPulse is going to change the world because we've already changed the miners. All the miners are fighting to get involved with our technology. Without it, we won't be able to mine the copper you need to have the energy transition or the other ancillary metals. And the military wants those metals anyway. So mining will revolutionize itself. The major mining companies are talking to each other and recognizing the scale of the problem. They're all making good steps at varying speeds, of course. The biggest miner is BHP, and BHP is led by a visionary CEO. He's invested in what we're doing. And then Rio Tinto came along, number 2, Codelco's big in copper. We're all talking to each other. First, the miners have to get organized, and then we will save the world. At the Colorado School of Mines, which is probably generally considered the world's best mining school, there's a lot of great schools for mining, but Colorado School of Mines is a big deal. They have 2 bumper stickers that were very popular there the last 20 years. The first one was, "Stop mining. Let the bastards freeze in the dark." So if you shut down all the coal and oil that's being burnt today, the bastards freeze in the dark. Stop mining. And then the other one was, "Earth first. We'll mine the other planets later." Well, that's exactly what Elon is proposing to do. He's going to take a 3D printer to Mars and start mining in Mars so that our species can live on in the event we blow up this planet. Now, I'd rather stay here. I'd rather do what we can for the 8 billion people and the limitless species on this planet. And I'd really like to play a role in educating the average person who hasn't got a clue about the supply chain. That we've got to start screaming about how important it is that we really make a realistic engineering attempt with things like geothermal power or a renaissance in nuclear power. And we need all the billionaires to help. And we got to stop beating up the billionaires with a stick, because some billionaires are better than others. Some billionaires are better than others. At least Elon's making an effort to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And there are plenty of other billionaires to go around. Now, we don't need billionaires if governments would put up the money, but generally the billionaires make all the choices and make things happen faster. So I know this is a long and bizarre rant, but I'm frustrated that the 200 Smarter Markets podcasts we've made already haven't saved the world. We've started a conversation, and there are people in the financial markets interested in how this affects their money. That's true. But as a species, we have not even made the first baby steps towards changing how we generate power, how we transmit that power to the point of use, and then how we change the way we convert that power to chemical energy in a battery for an electric car. And so we really need to educate everybody about the scale of the problem. This massive undertaking should lead to world peace, not world war.
Thanks again to Robert Friedland, founder and executive chairman at Ivanhoe Mines. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of Markets in Transition. We hope you'll join us.
This episode was brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets? Contact us at onboarding@abax.exchange. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.